Hello, Dr. Jordan. How are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for being able to do this, especially during finals week. And
Thank you for having me.
of course, this is to anybody who's watching the interview. This is Dr. Jenna Jordan. She is a PhD in political science at Atlanta Tech, and she is an expert in civil conflict and political strife, and a lot of the things that I cover in this blog. And Jenna, I'm just going to go ahead and get right into it and ask you some of the critical questions pertaining to the blog topic. Uh, question,
Okay.
question number one: do you think that domination of a natural resource can accommodate a dictatorship with resources to wage a war against an ideologically opposed group, like in the case of the Sudanese civil wars?
Okay. Well, I think that, just one quick, I want to add before we start. I'm actually at Georgia Tech. It's in Atlanta, but it's just called Georgia Tech. So,
Thank
um,
you.
one point of clarification. Um, and I teach in the School of International Affairs. But yes, I'm a political scientist by training. So, as far as natural resources go, I absolutely think that natural resources can aid a group that is trying to wage war. Resources are a key way in which groups can get the resources necessary to wage war. In the case of natural resources, I think that the benefits ultimately can be found not so much in the type of resource, but rather in the resource's monetary worth, or in the power that a group has in controlling that particular resource. So I think that the resources where they really come in is really in sort of monetary sort of ways and in power. So thinking about who's controlling them. Um, and so this what these resources can do is it can provide that group who's controlling the resource with the ability to coerce other actors, or to attain compliance from local communities or groups to which it's opposed. So it's a way for groups, resources can provide sort of a way for groups to coerce others or to engage in some kind of compelling activity to get others to basically do what they want them to do. Um, Now, natural resources can certainly help a dictatorship who's trying to wage war against a particular group. But I don't think it really makes a difference whether the conflict itself is ideological or separatist or ethnic or about political participation. Um, Now, in this regard, there's actually a large body of literature that looks at the onset of intrastate conflict, and particularly civil war. But I think we can apply this more generally to conflict within borders and argue that having opportunities to wage war makes war more likely. So some of these variables are sort of these structural variables that are seen as providing that opportunity are things like rough terrain, which, for instance, if you have an insurgent group, if they have rough terrain, might have a better ability to hide or
like
wage
in
more effective,
like in Yemen, for instance.
like in Yemen or Afghanistan, something like that. But the other sort of variable people look at in terms of opportunity is natural resources and how having access to natural resources can also make civil conflict more likely, which is one of the reasons I think why we see, or one possible explanation for why we see civil wars occurring so frequently in areas that are high in certain kinds of natural resources, like oil, for instance. Um, so if groups had these access to resources, they may be more likely to start or engage in war because they know have the capacity to do so. So it provides an opportunity. Now, this overlooks the issue of motivation, which is very multifaceted and can take on a bunch of different sorts of dimensions. But it rather focuses on opportunity. And so I think, sort of relating it back to your initial question about dictatorships, I think that a similar logic would then apply to dictators trying to carry out conflict against non-state actors. So if they have access to resources which provides them a monetary ability or the ability to coerce local actors, then it might make conflict more likely.
Local militias, ethno-religious
Mhm.
persecution, and such.
Exactly.
Awesome.
Exactly.
All right, great. Question number two. If the known proven geological resources of a nation are great, should that compel a marginalized group to either rally up or join a militia to seize those assets, putting existing non-constitutional centralized government in constant jeopardy of a military coup d'etat?
Okay, so let me just think for 1 second. I'm just sort of reformulating my answer a little bit. Um, so I think that the argument that I made above would still apply. And as far as thinking about opportunity, the logic is the same, that natural resources would provide the opportunity to carry out conflict and thus make conflict more likely to occur. Now, the issue of joining a militia in order to seize resources is a different one, right? The nature of the conflict is different. Now, I think my question for you is what you mean by marginalized group. So some groups might have the desire, but perhaps not the capacity to seize the assets to the extent that they would be able to effectively challenge the government. Other groups who might have been excluded from the current government might have more ability to carry out a coup d'etat, but I don't think that would be a function of its ability to seize resources. I think that it's a function of its strength prior to its potential desire to try to seize resources. So I think that resources for that would sort of come from elsewhere, right? They're not going to come from natural resources. They're going to come from the power that a group might have to challenge an existing government. Also, I think I guess one question for you, which I think I'm going to pose back, is you have to think, why would it make a difference if it was constitutional or not, right? Because coup d'etats can occur in many different political contexts and against many different types of organizations.
Right. Gosh, it would seem that a constitutional government is one where people would feel less disenfranchised because they would have some sort of human rights. Human rights are more observed in constitutional type governments, whether it be a constitutional monarchy or parliamentary system of government with a legal system and all sorts of implied rights, and they apply conventions on human rights that have been put down in Geneva and the United Nations and such. I figured
No,
constitution.
I think that's right. I guess I was just trying to think like if there was something specific you were trying to get at. Because no, you're absolutely right. I mean, coup d'états normally occur against non-democratic regimes, of course, because you have marginalized groups that don't have access to alternative means of political participation, right? So the options available, and actually, this is really a whole debate that I find really fascinating about whether or not, even aside from coup d'états, but thinking about political violence in general, whether it's more likely to occur against democratic or non-democratic regimes, which is actually a whole really interesting debate in the field of terrorism and sort of the area that I study. And there's actually, surprisingly, arguments on both sides. So some people feel that you're more likely to see acts of terrorism against democratic, constitutional governments because they're more easily coerced, right? Because they're sensitive to the costs of their constituencies, whereas
Right.
authoritarian regimes don't care as much, so they're harder to coerce. So you're going to see sort of movements against them as harder, right? It's
More
going to be seen as
overtly belligerent actions to get them removed.
exactly, and they might be willing to use more intense mechanisms to crush those particular movements. But then we have the question of foreign policy designed to try to democratize nations and regimes as a way to overcome terrorism problems, and that's obviously a whole nother kind of debate that we could get into. But those are, I think, some of the issues. So it is interesting that you mentioned that. I guess that's why I asked, because I was thinking in my head about democracy versus non-democracy and militant activity.
Awesome. Great. Moving on to question number 3. As the availability of easily extracted and imported fossil fuel becomes scarcer, could countries with nominal central governance become targets for exploitation by publicly traded multinational energy corporations that are based in countries with dubious human rights records, such as the Greater Nile Petroleum Operating Company in Sudan?
Okay, so okay, so I actually have another question for you, and I was looking at this question initially. What exactly do you mean by exploitation? Like in what way? In what sort of process were you thinking in your mind when you wrote the question?
The Greater Nile Petroleum Operating Company is a consortium that's a 40% stake by the Chinese Petroleum State Petroleum Agency, a 25% stake by a Malaysian state o- state-run oil organization, and a 15% stake by an Indian. So it's basically a multinational consortium to
Right.
get all the oil out of the Sudan. And the both of the regimes are supplied weapons from China, and
Right.
it seems like it's just a bonanza for uh, for for fomenting a civil war that seems to go on and on and on. And the only people that really seem to get rich off of it are these international actors.
Okay. So you're not necessarily meaning sort so just sort of taking advantage of weak governance to go in and sort of do what they want. Is that sort of what you mean?
Yes,
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I would generally say absolutely yes. Multinational corporations take advantage of weak governments, right, all the time. And they have lots of leverage over weaker governments because they can threaten to pull out business, right? And these governments are, benefiting from these from having operations within their borders, right? So they can threaten to pull out business if there's too many regulations in place or too many worker protections or too many, I don't know, any kinds of regulations on the business itself. So in the case of energy, I mean, and I think this applies to all kinds of multinational corporations operating within the borders of other countries, not just countries that are dealing in petroleum. Um, so I would say, yes, I would say when big companies have something that weak governments need, which is business in their country, right? The companies essentially hold the cards, right? They're the ones that are able to dictate what goes on to a large degree.
great. Moving on to question 4. In a scenario where a centralized government has limited scope in its ability to provide basic services and infrastructure, can a multinational corporation with its assets and logistical capabilities act as a proxy provider of these services, alleviating the centralized government of these basic responsibilities?
Um, yes, I actually think this is a really this is actually a really interesting question. Um, so not only can multinational corporations work with the government, right? They can also work with international non-governmental organizations, which they have been doing, right? And sort of a bid to try to, I think, perhaps look nicer, right? Look less
The charm
menacing,
offensive.
trying to be a little like we're good. See, we're working with these INGOs, um, and working with them in order to put pressure on governments to make changes. Now, there are risks involved with multinational corporations working with weak governments in order to help develop infrastructure. Sometimes these multinational corporations get involved, as I mentioned before, with weak states because there's fewer regulations, labor's cheaper, right? So this maximizes profits for them. They can threaten to leave, which would result in job losses for the poor, for the poorer countries. Now, multinational corporations can also take business away from local contractors, which is a big problem. And this further can inhibit the ability of the country to rebuild its infrastructure. And I think this was really a problem that sort of plagued Iraqi post-war construction plans, is that you had all the contracts going to these big multinational firms, and Iraqi firms got something, I think it was like 2% of the contracts. So
It was actually stipulated that Halliburton was to get it was only going to be Halliburton affiliates because they were worried about infiltration of the infrastructure by outside actors, and it really
right,
is-
exactly.
it set a super bad precedent.
So yeah, that's exactly right. So you would think that a country trying to rebuild its infrastructure, that you would try to encourage local companies to engage in that process of rebuilding infrastructure.
Including the
Um,
actual people that are in the occupied lands. It would make perfect
yeah,
sense.
exactly. That's exactly right. Now, one thing that I find really interesting about sort of the ability of a weak government to provide services, even beyond sort of multinational corporations and their role in infrastructure building, is how militant organizations can come in and also take advantage of a weak government not being able to provide basic services to its people. And this is a huge problem in lots of conflict-torn countries where there is a weakened centralized government. This is the case in Yemen. This was the case in Somalia, in Iraq. So you have like local organizations with the Israeli-Palestinian issue, right, where you have local militant organizations that are able to come in where the reach of the government is not able to effectively like help people,
Like
and they,
Hamas.
pardon,
Like Hamas.
like Hamas, exactly, and Hamas gained a huge amount of political legitimacy because they were able to come in and provide services, particularly in Gaza.
Hospitals and madrasas.
That's right, and religious education and secular education and schools and support groups and food and money and all of these things that the Israelis are not providing for the people in Gaza, or that the Pakistanis are not able to provide in the federally administered tribal areas where you see lots of militant activity, or in Yemen where you saw and Somalia where you have Al Qaeda or Al Shabaab coming in and now providing social services, and in doing so being able to exert control over like large swaths of territory, or not necessarily large in all cases. So this is a huge issue. I think this is a really big issue. And so what it does is it provides support for these organizations. So this is sort of the context of weakened government that you then see, their inability to provide services sort of allows lots of different actors to come in, right? Whether it's a multinational corporation to take advantage and rebuild infrastructure, or whether it's local militant organizations to provide social services and get more support. And, ultimately, like in the case of Hamas, winning legislative elections in Gaza in 2006, becoming a legitimate political part of the legitimate political process in the territory. So,
Great. Question number 5. In a globalized world connected by the internet, bad news travels a lot faster. Climate change is no longer a myth, and ecological disasters caused by energy resource management have created ecological disasters of unprecedented scope, like the Deepwater Discovery in the Gulf of Mexico and the Fukushima Daiichi in Japan. Would a humanistic posture with philanthropic programs be a sort of charm offensive necessary for an established energy company to be able to operate, grow, and diversify their existing portfolios, especially in a developing nation that lacks the infrastructure to control its own natural resources?
so I just want to make sure. So do you mean that basically do these companies need to sort of present themselves as, philanthropic sort of good guys in order to really be able to be effective and grow in those countries? Is that sort of what you're asking?
Yes, essentially.
Okay. Yeah. Tell me if I'm missing something subtle, because I'm happy to.
Jenna, you're the professor. I'm I'm
Okay.
the undergrad.
Okay. Well, I just want to make sure I'm answering your question in the right way, because sometimes professors like to go on and on and on and not answer questions right.
That's
Okay.
why we like you so much, Jenna.
I think that's absolutely right. I think that's perfectly right. All companies are concerned with their public image. Um, they need customers, right? And particularly in a globalized world, a company's image is now perceived worldwide, right? So something a company does, even in a small country, everyone across the globe will see, right? This is with the process of, with globalization. I mean, and it's immediate. And even though weaker companies, um, well, okay, so I think that thinking about their global image, you also have, right? So, I mean, in addition to just sort of everyone being able to see what's going on and how companies are acting, you also have non-governmental organizations and INGOs drawing attention to issues that are specifically related to human security, right? And they're benefiting from a globalized world. They're benefiting from the fact that they can provide information about what different multinational corporations are doing to the public, to people. They can put pressure on governments to influence the activities of multinational corporations. They can even go through back channels. They can influence one country to pressure another. So there's lots of different tools by which this sort of global civil society is able to bring this attention to the forefront and force either countries or multinational corporations to behave in ways where they need to be concerned about human rights and human security, and these issues. So I think that it does. I mean, maybe I'm idealistic, but I would like to hope that it would start to hold certain multinational corporations more accountable
Accountable.
for their
Awesome.
activities. But
Awesome.
I'm probably just too much of an optimist.
That's the right attitude. It's all about attitude these days. Um, all right, moving on to part two. It's been
All right.
theorized. It's been sorry. It's been theorized that there has been a Western hegemony of natural resources, petroleum in particular, in the Middle East that dates as far back as the Sykes-Picot Agreement after World War One. The Sykes-Picot Agreement carved up the borders of the nations of the Arabian Peninsula in a way that seemed to preclude future sectarian violence, so the Arab nations would not be able to fully assert their control over their resources due to political instability. When Arab strongmen, such as the Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran, Saddam Hussein in Iraq, and Bashar Assad assert control over their national resources, the money is then used to fund terrorist organizations such as Hezbollah and other apparatuses of state-sponsored terrorism. What do you feel is the most effective method in foreign policy to mitigate this dilemma?
Okay, that's a big question. There's a lot going on there. Now, I mean, personally, I find and like, this would probably be a topic for another time, but I find that the sort of carving up of borders and the issues of territoriality and where borders are drawn to be really, really interesting and important, and shaping future conflicts in very real ways. I will disagree that I don't think that the way the borders were carved up um, was done in a way to preclude future sectarian violence. I think that, if anything, they they might have allowed for future sectarian conflicts. But I think so. Okay, so that was kind of just my first issue. Now, as far as money, asserting control over natural resources, over national resources, and having that money be used to fund terrorist organizations. I think that sort of, I'm going to more speak to that part of your question.
Great.
So I think that it's not that the money came from control over national resources. I think whether or not these countries, how much control they have over their national resources or natural resources or oil production or whatever it may be, I mean, it allows them to have money to fund militant groups. But I think that's the issue. So not necessarily where the money came from, but the fact that these leaders decided to wage particular kinds of conflict through funding terrorist organizations. So, and I think that, to me, the state funding of terrorism is really, really critical here. State sponsorship of terrorism. There's lots of different issues you could think about, and I think the case of Iran, Iraq, and Syria, I mean, these are the key players in terms of state sponsorship. So you can think about reasons why they did this.
I did mention Saudi Arabia, correct?
I don't see it in the question, but
I
yes.
probably, I probably, as far as state sponsors, what they sponsor a lot of Sunni militias, so and
Yes.
a lot of them aren't very nice either. So we
They're
should
not very
definitely.
nice. So this is all related. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. This is all related um, to sectarian violence, right? I mean, that's ultimately what it all comes to. So you've got, Iran funding Hezbollah, right? Because they all, the Shia connection. You have Assad allowing weapons to go through Syria from Iran to Hezbollah in Lebanon. You had Iraq obviously funding, under Saddam Hussein, funding lots of terrorist activity, lots of militant activity. So really, it almost becomes sort of a way for states to wage war against other countries in an indirect way, or to deal with sectarian conflict, right, in an indirect way. So the idea is that, so the problems, so I guess there's benefits and drawbacks for the states that are doing the sponsorship, right? So some of the benefits is that it allows them to get involved in activity, but not directly be involved, right? So Iran and Iraq, right, were not great friends and fought lots. And so funding militant activity was a way for them to sort of get at each other without fighting directly. And now we see with Syria, and Hezbollah, I think a really sort of interesting and kind of tricky situation where you have, Hezbollah, Shia, right, supporting Assad, and then you have the Sunni militants who are fighting Hezbollah in Lebanon, now fighting Hezbollah in Syria,
Right.
because this is a new place for them to carry out their conflict. So state sponsorship really, and then you have the U.S. trying to figure out who to fund, right?
Right.
Are we funding the militants, right, who are basically allied with Al Qaeda in fighting Assad? So it's a tricky situation. So I think the state sponsorship issue is really, really important and really interesting. Um, but it complicates issues. But what it does is it allows these governments to fight wars in ways that they don't necessarily have to take immediate responsibility for. The problem is then when they do fund these militant organizations, they give up control over the conflict in some way, right? Because now they're relying on others to fight their wars for them. So those are some of the risks involved for states that are sponsoring terrorist organizations.
Great.
So
We're
it was kind of circuitous answer, I guess, but yeah, I'm just trying to think if I had anything else I wanted to add to this. No, I think that's, yeah. We could move on. Oh, that was the last question. What is the most effective method in foreign policy to mitigate this dilemma?
uh-huh.
That's the question I wanted to address before we moved on. Um, yeah, I
Actually,
don't know.
Jenna, this is we're getting close to the max on the
Oh,
screencaster.
okay.
So
We'll
this
move
one
on. Sorry.
so this one will probably wrap it up.
Okay. I can answer another question. We can move on if you want.
Oh no, I finished with that one. I'd really like to hear
Oh,
it.
okay. Um, yeah, that's a really great question. I feel like if we all knew that answer, we'd be like advising foreign policy right now, So, obviously the US has tried economic sanctions, right, withholding aid at certain times, which has, had mixed record. I mean, there's been lots of studies on sanctions, and overall, most of the studies at least that I've read in political science have found that sanctions are ineffective in coercing government. So perhaps that's not the best way. A lot of the